EDHRec is a fascinating tool that has grown to monolithic stature, eclipsing most other resources in the EDH ecosystem. And this is not for no reason. A neatly organized, ordered list of what cards other people play is a useful tool. Other people put thought and effort into crafting decks, and you get a summary of that effort delivered directly to your eyes via snappy UI. However, it's not a perfect tool, due to a variety of factors. In the first Magic the Gathering video I posted to this channel, I made a point to discuss some downsides of EDHRec that I hadn't seen mentioned before. And while it's a cool video that you should definitely go watch, the contents of that video aren't what I want to talk about today. Instead, I want to talk about a point brought up in the comments to that video, that being that displaying cards by percent inclusion in decks flattens a lot of information about the decks they're played in. If there are 3 cards each played in a third of decks, it's difficult to tell whether they're all played in the same third of decks, if they're all played in different decks, or something in between. And this is a flaw pretty inherent to the construction of the website. It's not some emergent problem that popped up and is awaiting a solution. But it got me thinking, is there anything that users of the website can do to adapt to this fact? When I look at a card on EDHRec, can I figure out what it's doing there, what other cards go with it, and what all that says about the decks it's played in, or even the players that built those decks? The answer to this question is complicated, but as a process it's taken me down a series of rabbit holes as useful as they are bizarre, and I want to share that journey with you today. As a fairly straightforward example, in late December I was looking to make an aggressive partner commanders deck, and I was intrigued by the commander pairing of Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator, and the freshly printed Francisco, Foul Marauder. The appeal to me was strong. 2 low-cost partners, one of which ramps and the other of which filters, which can be paired with a further slate of low-cost pirates to enable all sorts of shenanigans. EDHRec had a mere 310 decks for this freshly minted pairing, so a question we can ask is, who else jumped on these 2 as a worthwhile commander pair? Looking at the 10 high synergy cards, the ones disproportionately run in this commander pair compared to the color as a whole, offers a clear picture. Almost 60% of Francisco Malcolm decks run Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, an instant win combo requiring a mere 2 cards and 3 mana. Looking further, we can see a bunch more high-powered staples also at around 60% usage, but scroll down a bit beyond that and we can see a very different type of card at approximately 35% usage. A couple 4-mana pirates with abilities useful in slower, more mid-rangey decks. Ramirez and Hostage Taker are both fun cards, but they're decidedly not mana well spent in a CEDH Thoracle deck. For this reason, I'm going to call these 2 cards, along with Thoracle, indicator cards. Cards that give you a rough idea on the upper bound of players playing a particular type of deck. If I use the indicator cards of Thoracle and Ramirez, I can start to construct a Venn diagram with a combo circle containing 58% of decks and a mid-range circle containing 36% of decks. I wouldn't expect a ton of overlap, and indeed, a search with EDHRec's filter feature, plus some quick math, tells me that there's about 7% of decks that run both cards, and about 13% of decks that run neither card. Now, what does this sort of analysis tell me? Well, my first takeaway from seeing the 58% Thoracle play rate was, goddamn, I guess I'm on the right track if I'm looking to make a high-powered deck. To be clear, Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation will be run in some percentage of any deck with blue and black in it, but 58% is a lot of decks. While it's not a win con I'd go for, the fact that such a high percentage of people building Francisco Malcolm run Thoracle communicates to me, somebody who's building on a budget, that I'm probably getting a lot of bang for my 84 cents from the command zone. For my part, I ended up including none of the indicator cards I mentioned in the deck I ended up building, because I'm a unique and special boy. For another example, about a year ago I was building a skeleton ship deck. It was intended to be a glacially slow proliferate deck, and it had all the fixins, the parallax enchantments, some impressively slow win cons, and the original storage lands that enter tapped and don't tap for non-stored mana. The commander was a card that could be played as a mediocre removal engine, but most games it just sits there as a meme, a perfect encapsulation of the slow mass of nothing I was doing. So, what decks do other skeleton ship players build? Looking at the high synergy cards, the top 5 are all cards that pair with skeleton ship's ability, so already other people are deviating from my game plan by actually caring about the commander. Next up, in roughly 50% of decks, are a bunch of proliferate cards, which seems sensible enough to me, that's what I'm doing. After that, in about 30% of decks, are a bunch of skeletons, and in about 15% of decks are a handful of questionable but undeniably skeleton-themed cards. Excellent. Okay, so these are going to be the three archetypes, with our indicator cards for each being Freed from the Real, Thrumming Bird, and Reassembling Skeleton. We can now make a triple Venn diagram and fill it out by simply plugging in every combination of these three cards in EDHRec's filter tool. And upon doing this, the first thing I noticed was that Cares About Commander ability and Cares About Counters seem almost like one diverse supercategory, whereas skeletons were definitely more distinct. If you're a freak like me, you're probably also wondering, what is that other 15%? I did another filter excluding these indicator cards, plus an additional one for each category to account for slight variances in card choice, and the result is pirates and cards with ships on them. Respect, honestly. The skeleton ship page was fascinating for the opposite reason as the Francisco Malcolm one. This EDHRec page looks something like a tour of low-power EDH. There's the players who are earnestly building around the glorious card known as Skeleton Ship, the players who took it as a jumping-off point for some strange quest into the unknown, the people who are here for a commander for their janky skeletons deck, and the people who just appreciate the card for all its skeleton and ship goodness. I picked out Skeleton Ship as the commander for my bad meme deck, and it looks like I'm in good company with that fact. But the interesting thing is how many different types of meme are present here. And honestly, the process of making this video and returning to the glorious EDHRec page has only increased my amount of love for all my bone homies out there, living their best Skeleton Ship lives. For our third example, let's talk about Arkelos Lagoon Mystic. This page has a lot more decks than the previous two I mentioned, and yet somehow it's honestly the most confusing EDHRec page I've ever been on. High up on the page, we get some stuff that makes sense, things that tap and untap the commander, and lands matter cards. Sure, that makes sense. Cards that lead to lands entering tapped are good when the commander has them come in untapped. We also get Villainous Wealth. Okay, yeah, I guess if you're playing a lot of lands, you may as well have an appropriately colored outlet. And then you get down to stuff like King Makar, the Gold Cursed. Are people playing him because Arkelos has him enter tapped, and thus lets you get an Inspire trigger a turn early? Maybe, but there's also a lot of tap-untap synergies sprinkled throughout the page. Not enough for me to get a confident idea of what people are doing, but certainly a handful, seemingly present in a hair over 20% of decks. Next up is Tribal Turtle decks, and for this we can see a bunch of turtles played in roughly 15% of decks, with about half that many decks also running a bunch of questionable turtle-themed cards. We'll call these turtle players and dedicated turtle players. Finally, let's talk gates. The indicator cards I'm going to use here are Baldur's Gate, Nine Fingers Keen, and Maze's End, cards played in a decent portion of decks that you'd probably only want in a Gates deck. Now, these play rates confuse me a little because, in my opinion as a professional Gates enjoyer, Baldur's Gate is a much worse card than these other two. For early game purposes, it's a wastes in a 3-color deck, and the limitation to 3 colors means that even if you run every single in-color gate, only a third of your lands will be gates. I don't love Keen either. Its triggers will whiff more than a quarter of the time in a 3-color deck, but at least it's a decently statted creature. Maze's End is my personal favorite in an Arkelos deck. It comes in untapped, and can find you an untapped gate immediately, and can be paired nicely with extra land play effects. And that's not even the strongest way to use Maze's End in an Arkelos deck. I recently posted a video to my Patreon discussing what ended up being my highest effort deck, and you can stick around to the end of the video for a preview of that. On some level, these adventures are cool simply because I enjoy them. I enjoy a good puzzle. I enjoy putting myself in somebody else's brain and asking why they decided to run a particular card. In theory, EDHRec has an archetypes feature that gives breakdowns on different deck types, but it's not very good. Wow, you're telling me there are Francisco Malcolm decks that involve pirates, treasure, and sacrificing? That's crazy. I never would have guessed. So, in absence of a feature like this, I enjoy the challenge of snooping around and figuring things out. However, this is also the part of the video where I tell you that this goofy little thing I like to do while using EDHRec is actually a fantastic exercise that will prevent all sorts of mistakes down the line. One of the biggest pitfalls I've seen EDHRec users fall into is when they add cards that look good without thinking about what deck those cards belong in or how many of a single card type belong in a deck. This results in decks which have some amount of synergy in theory, but which in practice feel disjointed and clunky, containing a Frankenstein-like mishmash of components from various decks. For this reason, I'd advocate spending an extra moment trying to parse what specific types of deck are actually being built with the different cards. Even just keeping in mind that there are different decks doing different things within a given commander will likely be a great help to newer players. EDHRec is a good tool, but it's not one you can go on autopilot with. To echo the conclusion of the EDHRec effect, you should try to keep in mind where the cards you're looking at are coming from, and that, no matter how snappy the UI is, the stuff you're seeing isn't magical. It's just data slurry. With that said, thanks for watching, and here's a preview of a bonus video I made about the Arkelos deck I ended up building. I had begun to mentally catalog this deck idea as a failure when I once again stumbled upon Maze's End, and this time the gears really got turning. Fundamentally, the issue with Maze's End is that it's both incredibly visible and glacially slow. That slowness is due both to the extremeness of the win condition and the requirement of running a ton of tap lands, downsides which exist in a state of tension. Every turn of playing a non-gate land means an extra Maze's End activation that's required down the road. However, these downsides can be mostly eliminated by simply playing all of the gates at once through an effect like Scapeshift or Reshape the Earth.